Hello everybody, my name is Sam Wetzel, and I will be teaching you all how to play chess. Okay everybody, let's start by saying that this is chess. I have set up the game just how it should start, and we are playing as the white pieces today. We will be talking by as if we were the white pieces. So this is a chessboard. It is set up as an 8x8 with each square alternating in color. The squares are usually white and a different color. In this case, we have white and blue, so they alternate white, blue, white, blue, white, blue across the whole entire board. To begin, let's talk about the pawn. In this case, we have Air Force versus Marines. So here's Air Force, which we're considering white, and here's Marines, the Marines who we're considering the black pieces. Now, since I'm white, I go first, and pawns can move couple different ways. First of all, when they take their first move out of this front column, which is where they first belong, they can move either forward 2 spaces or they can move forward once. However, after the first time they are moved, they can only move 1 square at a time. Pawns also have specific ways of attacking. For instance, if I move my pawn straight up into this square, and the opponent moves their pawn here, I can then capture this pawn by moving on a diagonal, and I actually take their spot. I cannot capture by going forward. If 2 pawns are looking at each forward, they are actually both blocked and they cannot move unless one of these pieces is captured by another piece, or a piece moves to a spot where the pawn can capture it. Another way pawns can be captured are if my pawn eventually gets to this block and they move their pawn up 2 squares, and if only can I capture this pawn if this specific technique is if it comes out of this line. If it's the first time this pawn has been moved, and then I capture it by actually crossing on the same diagonal but behind it. I don't have to take the spot of the pawn. That's the only other way pawns can be captured, or pawns can capture other pieces. Lastly, pawns can also, once they get to the other side, for instance, if this pawn travels all the way across to the other side and is now in the opponent's last row, I then can make this pawn any piece I want on the chessboard except for the king. And because the queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard, most people make this piece the queen, so they have 2 queens, essentially. Next, we will be discussing the rook. This is the rook on both sides, or just different colors. Rooks have specific ways of movement. They can move any number of spaces to the left or right, or straight and back. They cannot move diagonally, though. They also capture in the same way that if they move forward, they capture the piece that's in front of them. For instance, this rook can capture this pawn by moving straight up and taking its spot. However, this rook cannot capture this queen because the pawn is blocking the queen. Therefore, the pawn needs to be captured first. Also, rooks cannot jump over any pieces. For instance, that pawn, it can't jump over to capture the queen, but it also can't jump over its own pieces. So, if my pawn was in front of the rook, it could not capture this pawn because my piece is blocking it from going straight. Therefore, the rook would take several moves and have to go up and around my pawn. So, in order to capture this pawn, instead of taking 1 move, if my pawn wasn't there by just going straight, this rook actually takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves in order to capture that pawn. Next, we will be talking about the knight. The knight is a very important piece throughout the game. As you can see, it is a pilot in the Air Force and a Marine officer. And knights are very important because they have specific ways of movement. They move in L shapes, so they go up 2 and over 1, or they go sideways 2 and up or back 1. But as long as it moves in an L shape, which takes 4 squares, if you include the square that it's on. It goes over 2, up 1, or over 2, down 1, or up 2, over 1, or up 2 to the left 1, or maybe over on this side, it can go over 2 and up 1, or over 2 and down 1, and it can also move backwards. And these are probably considered one of the most important pieces because they are the only piece that can capture the queen effectively, since the knight can put pressure on the queen, but the queen cannot put pressure back on the knight because the queen cannot, based on the way the movements of the queen, it can't attack the knight. But the knight can still capture the queen. Another great thing about the knight is that it can jump over pieces. So if my pawn is here, I can go 1, 2, and up 1. Or it can jump over opposing teammates by going 1, 2, and over 1. So that's why the knight is very effective, especially if it wants to capture something in the back row. Well, being this far away, I can still capture either the knight or the rook if my knight is there. So they are very effective pieces throughout the game. Next, we're going to talk about the bishop. The bishop is also very effective. It is much like the rook. It can move any number of spaces it wants, but the bishop only moves in diagonals. It captures the same way as the rook, whereas if there is a pawn in the way or a different piece, it moves diagonally to that point and then takes a spot. It, much like the rook, also can't jump over other pieces like the knight. So that includes the opponent's and your own. So it can only move up to the point next to your own piece, or it would have to capture the first piece that it comes in contact with for the opponent. It cannot go over and capture the rook in this case, in this scenario. Lastly, second to last, we will talk about the queen. The queen is considered one of the most powerful pieces because it is the rook and the bishop combined into one. The reason for this is because the queen can move unlimited spaces forward, backward, left, right, and diagonal. It captures much like the same of the bishop, the rook and the bishop, where it cannot jump over pieces and it must capture in the line. So as long as the queen can see it without seeing through another piece, it can capture it. They're also the most important because they're most powerful since they can move any number of spaces in almost any directions and cover a vast number of spaces if they are put in the center of the board. Lastly, we have the king. The king can only move one space at a time in any direction, and it can capture any piece, but it can never be threatened by a piece, or else it needs to be moved, or the piece threatening it needs to be captured. The king is very important to keep away from any enemies, and once you lose your king, the game is over, the other team has won. Now we're going to talk about some tips. Some tips include capturing the center. These 4 center pieces are probably the most important because once you have those 4 center pieces, you control the whole game chessboard, since you now have your pieces are further developed than your opponent's pieces, meaning you can cover more squares, you can control more squares, prohibiting your opponent from moving anywhere. Also, another very important thing is to develop your pieces. This means to get your pieces out from where they are and into the center of the board or around the board where they can cover a lot more spaces than if they were in this back row. For instance, in the beginning of the game, the rook, the bishop, the king, the queen, and your other 2 bishop and rook cannot move. You cannot move these pieces as your first move because it is impossible, because they are all trapped in the back row. Therefore, you need to start moving your pawns ahead so your bishops can get out, and once they're out, move your other bishops ahead so this rook can get out, and move possibly this pawn out so your queen can get out and start attacking. And this is very important. And what's also great is that the knight can also jump over pieces, so you do not have to worry about moving pieces in order to let him out. Therefore, you can move the pieces that are more important to get other pieces out and moving around the board. And this is probably one of the most important things in the game, is to try to get your pieces developed as quickly as possible, because then you can cover more spaces and put more pressure onto your opponent. Lastly, let's say you get your bishop out here and your knight out. Another important thing to do is to castle, which means it brings your king into a safer region of the board in a corner. So by castling, in order to castle, let's say you're castling to the right with this rook. The rook can never be moved. This has to be the rook's first move on with the king's first move, and there cannot be any spaces between the two pieces. So in order to castle, you move your king, in this case, over twice, 1, 2, and your rook comes around into that spot on the opposite side of the king. If you were to castle to the right, for instance, both of these pieces cannot be moved, and all three pieces between the two need to be out of the way, and then you move your king over twice, 1, 2, and your rook over once, or over to the other side. This is very important because it keeps your king guarded with these pawns, assuming you don't move them, and this rook. And it also brings your rooks together, which is also very important because they're more powerful together as they are able to conquer a lot more space, especially in rows, prohibiting some pieces to being able to get across. So by placing these pieces together, for instance, throughout right here on the board, pawns can't move over without being threatened, and nothing can actually move into this column without being threatened by your rook. Lastly, we're going to talk about how to win the game, which is by capturing the opponent's king. This can be done by rendering checkmate, and checkmate is when you corner the opponent's king in which he cannot move to any spot. For instance, if we had this scenario where we had our rook here guarding behind the king, prohibiting him from moving into these squares since he would be captured, and we have this pawn who is guarding these two spaces, so the king can't move here, the king is now left 3 spaces to move, 1, 2, and 3. However, we also have a bishop here, which is guarding these 2 spaces. Therefore, this king is only safe on the square it's on and the square to the right. But by moving our rook up, we put him into checkmate, since there is not one safe space the king can get to, and also nothing can attack this rook to get the king out of checkmate. So this pawn can't capture him. None of these pieces are helpful in capturing this piece. Although they might be able to capture this piece by doing that, that would be considered the opponent's team's move, and now it's white team's, and then he can capture. So as you can see, this piece is the essential piece. This piece is the one that needs to be captured in order to put the king into checkmate. Therefore, this piece is the one who needs to be captured in order to keep the king out of checkmate. Although that is a very drastic scenario, it is just an example of how pieces can be captured. So there you have it, the beautiful game of chess. It's very hard to learn, but once you learn it, I tell you, it's amazing. It's extremely fun to play, and it's probably one of the best games that you can play with your family or friends, or just to sit and have a cup of coffee. If you go to New York City, they play a lot of these games. You can download the game on your phone, chess.com, and it's truly exciting, and just have a lot of fun with it. Thank you.